Today, we have two sensational humans that I have the pleasure of knowing and working with, Dr. Layla Hashemi and Maya Shabi. I'm going to now do the awful thing and read from the script. This session takes a deep dive into the world of cybercrime, where we will learn about disrupting supply chains and financing for organized criminal and terrorist networks to shut down the rising flow of these threats around the world. Moderated by our own Maya Shabi, an expert in counterterrorism and risk mitigation and analysis. We welcome Dr. Hashemi, whose work uses data analytics to examine the intersection of digital technology, internet policy, and human rights. Dr. Hashemi was most recently at the Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption Center, TRACC, and recently joined C4 Ads, that's C, the number 4, ads, a nonprofit with a mission to disrupt illicit networks and threaten global peace and security. With that, I thank you both for coming and sharing your awesome wisdom with us. Maya, I'm going to hand it over to you to kick off the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Melissa. Appreciate it. So, Dr. Hashemi, thank you so much from my perspective as well. It's been such a pleasure working with you and putting this together. Before we dive in, I know you've prepared a couple of slides, but I was hoping you could kind of talk to us a little bit about what you personally want to address in the e-commerce industry and what you love about your work and how we got started here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Maya. I want to thank Melissa, Aileen, and everyone at EverC for having me today. So as Melissa mentioned, I am a previous data analyst and postdoctoral research fellow at TRAC, which is the Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption Center. That is sort of where I made my debut into the transnational crime and illicit trade scene, working with Dr. Louise Shelley. So a big shout out to her. And since then, which was many moons ago, I've been really loving actually events like this, where we're working across sector, where I'm getting to engage with the financial sector now with my new role at C4 as the program director of organized crime and corruption, really wanting to bring that both like multidisciplinary research, but also multi-sector, cross-sector, whole of society solutions to these problems. Specifically, I am interested in making an impact in countering crime. Melissa, Maya, and I talk about this all the time of, going after the bad actors. And that's probably my primary reason, is to kind of protect consumers and all stakeholders. I think these kinds of forums are really, really important, as they allow us to sort of collaborate and really build a community and these partnerships that are win-win situations. I think there's a lot in this space where there's a bit of possessiveness is maybe not the right word, but not as much collaboration. I really like to push for data analytics, since that's sort of my background, in being able to share data in a constructive way where it is a win-win. We've had a lot of I think that there's a lot of touting of like public-private partnerships without necessarily backing that up with evidence of successful public-private partnerships. So I'll talk into today with my talk. And then Aileen was saying in the last call, like really fostering this culture of compliance. And like as today, the whole theme is based around safer commerce, right? So one of my goals in life is to really educate all stakeholders, but specifically consumers. So this whole idea of like looking at supply chains and looking at the demand and the supply of, and as I'll mention in a moment, works with like counterfeits and sort of demystifying or just like countering these ideas that like a counterfeit luxury bag is a harmless good, and really getting to the back end of that. How does that impact the environment, labor, human rights?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I know that we prepared a little bit of a visual aspect with the slides that you're going to present, and if Katie, we can go ahead and get that uploaded, and we're going to get going on some criminal and terrorist supply network chains and how and the methods that are used for cyber-enabled fraud and money laundering, how the money actually flows. And you're such a wonderful expert on this, and I'd really love to dive in with you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so we can go ahead and go on to the next slide, actually. So yeah, first, why should we care about counterfeits? So counterfeiting is the largest criminal enterprise in the world. Sales of counterfeit and pirated goods are difficult to quantify, but estimates range anywhere from $500 billion to $1.7 trillion per year. In 2018, Europol seized over 13 million doses of counterfeit drugs. That was worth more than $180 million. And if we think about this, this is really illicit financing of just one product in one region. You can see in this diagram from CBP in 2020, the IPR seizures that most of these were coming from China, about 44%, or generally the Asia region. 90% of these counterfeit seizures occurred in international express mail, which is a really common channel for transporting these materials. And as I mentioned, counterfeit's not limited to one sector. I won't touch upon this today, but I think this is relevant in bringing this sort of story back to everyone's personal lives. Counterfeit auto parts or sort of industrial equipment are also pretty common and pose tremendous harm. So CBP actually did a report in March 2021 looking at examples of counterfeit automotive parts. These can be airbags that are improperly deployed, brake pads that might not be up to the original manufacturer specifications, or just generally auto body parts that won't hold up to those required safety measures in crashes. So I think that really, drives home why we can see that counterfeiting is not just an issue of these harmless luxury goods, but that this, counterfeit industrial and other consumer products really pose tremendous threats to health and safety, the economy, and the environment.
Yeah, and not to mention it's brand damaging for, say, that auto part or any other kind of company that's producing it. So a buyer would think that they're getting some kind of legitimate and safety tested product. So yeah, like you just said, it operates on multiple levels, the worst being that it presents physical and safety risk to a lot of people.
Absolutely. Yeah, and the brands are really important too, which we'll get to on the next slide, actually. Read my mind. So really quickly, I'd like to go over some of the case studies that I've looked at counterfeits and generally illicit trade. One looking at antiquities. We had a great project that I'll get into. Antiquities, some of you might not be familiar with these products. They're generally sometimes called cultural heritage or cultural property. The project that I worked on specifically looked at coins in cuneiform, as these are really small objects and easily transported. I'll then move on to some of the pharmaceutical and PPE or personal protective equipment research that we did. This is a very broad overview slide, but to Maya's point earlier, we had a phenomenal partnership with 3M looking at counterfeit respirators or face masks during the COVID-19 pandemic that I think is an excellent example of how we can have constructive public-private partnerships, and research for all of these projects was conducted on the open and the dark web. Next slide, please. So a really quick overview, looking at antiquities, is a background on the Class C project, the countering of the looting of antiquities in Syria and Iraq. So first, many of us know that Iraq and Syria have been heavily impacted by war that's associated with terrorism. And this led to a huge surge of looting of archaeological sites across the region, as well as the production of counterfeit artifacts. So it's widely believed that the trafficking of these objects generates substantial revenue for conducting acts of terrorism. And because of this, the Class C project, which was run by TRAC, funded by Department of State Bureau of Counterterrorism, our aim was to collect and analyze primary data and to investigate the complex and non-transparent trafficking processes. Our data was predominantly gathered from publicly available online sources, which is really my wheelhouse when I look at these kinds of things. This is really where antiquities trade is concentrated and provides really globally reaching, no questions asked opportunities for sales. So in this image on the right, we can see an example of how social media platforms like Facebook are used to advertise and sell potentially looted objects. We used a variety of tools, which I'll mention in the next slide. But our last thing on this slide is that our research really acknowledged that one of the major stimuli of this trafficking of antiquities is demand. So we therefore really sought for ways to promote responsible purchase and collection of ancient objects. And I think this is a lesson that we can apply to all of the case studies. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. So we kind of approached this from two angles. We had a multilingual team of archaeologists, antiquity specialists, and criminal network investigators that carried out this state of the online market. So the first angle was online sales monitoring, where we looked at the general nature of the market, what materials were traded, what were their flows, as well as the sort of illegitimate practices employed in these transactions. We looked at over 60 different sites ranging from very large internationally recognized galleries, which many of you might recognize, to really small independent dealers operating on more decentralized e-commerce marketplaces like eBay. As I mentioned before, our monitoring really focused on small objects, as these are easily concealed and transported, and then thus less likely to be detected. We can see here an image of antiquity seized in 2016 during a raid on Islamic State fighters in Syria that were later returned to Iraq by the United States. This is just one of many examples, as I'm sure you've seen, which demonstrates really the importance of understanding the value of this trade. And I was talking to Maya about this before our session today, but really one of my main goals is to have people looking at the art on the wall, recognizing that art and antiquities specifically have very subjective value, so they make them their great conduits or items for which to like do any sort of overvaluing, any sort of trade-based money laundering. And then the second on the right, we deepened our understanding of sales networks through participant observation on social media. So we really were looking here at some of the most popular sites you've probably are all part of, such as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we also found that eBay and Etsy were really one of the leading, some of the leading platforms in that they're sort of interactive sales platforms with social media elements. Next slide, please.
I do have a question for you though. Whenever you were doing this investigation, what was it like when you reached out to these platforms, or did you get any communication or feedback from them once you reported, hey, you've got some antiquities that are being sold at raising a red flag?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. So the answer is really vague, but it depends. So for instance, during our classy final project sort of review, we had several sessions, like one for law enforcement, one for the general public, and one that I think involved specifically platforms. And I don't mean to, these are all my own individual opinions. We did have a representative from eBay that sort of had like thrown their hands up and said, like, we've tried to kind of address this issue on eBay and I don't think it's going to happen. eBay does tend to have, and I think some of these pictures might even be from eBay, tend to sell a lot of like hordes of coins. And because it's a little bit more of like a second hand platform where people are selling more of their individual goods, I think is, and it's also just been so long that it's been established, I think it's been difficult to regulate. On the flip side, eBay's admitted that they have a problem. On the flip side, engaging with platforms like Facebook, when we first started, there was no community standard against antiquities or art trafficking on the platform. And then in 2020, which was after the grant actually ended, Facebook did update their community standards to add a clause saying that you couldn't sell, I think they call it historical artifacts, and this was under the like human remains section of their community standards. So that's a great win, right, for us, is like from the policy world and sort of academia and the research and the impact that we're making with that research. The problem is, as many on the call probably know, is the enforcement of this. So it's great that they have this ban that came out in 2020. Did it change the fact that people were using, or vendors were using, Facebook and private Facebook groups to sell antiquities? The answer is unfortunately no. So those are just two sort of examples. In terms of galleries and auction houses and standalone sites, those are a bit easier to take down. There are, standards to say, like, if there's illicit activity happening through a particular website, to suspend it. The problem there, again, lies with like the whack-a-mole problem of as soon as you take a vendor site or a gallery, a smaller like independent gallery down, they'll just pop back up under a different domain. But yeah, excellent question. And just really briefly to go over some of the sales monitoring findings. It's really difficult to determine if an online, especially from an online image, whether a specific object was originally from Syria, Iraq, or elsewhere, or whether it's really counterfeit. There's often really low quality of these images, especially of items that are freshly dug up out of the ground. So if you are like buying antiquities, I'm not sure how many of you are interested, but if there's dirt on it, probably likely that it was freshly looted. Probably the biggest problem facing the sector is the problematic provenance, so lack of ownership history. There's a lot of falsified ownership history, and this really prevents us from understanding the object, where it came from, where it's been transported, and if it's meeting regulations. Sellers and buyers will often use false identities or even alter egos when selling online. And even though it was impossible to really trace, so part of this project was to trace financial flows to terrorist activity, it is assumed, and like the Holmes tax and a lot of the anecdotal evidence that we've seen, that antiquities can indeed make revenues for terrorism and other acts of violence. Next slide, please. So to quickly pivot to our other case studies, we just finished our third year of a 5-year NSF grant looking at supply chains of counterfeit PPE and pharmaceuticals. For counterfeit PPE, we're mostly looking at supply chains of respirators, face masks, and nitrile gloves, but the criminals really didn't stop there. We saw listings for COVID-19 tests, vaccination cards, or even the vaccines themselves. On the pharma side, the value of the pharmaceutical market is $200 billion annually. Internet sales of those counterfeit drugs account for about $75 billion of the total market. And it's estimated that 80% of the counterfeit drugs that are consumed in the United States come from overseas. A lot of these drugs are coming from India or China, where these chemicals and products are not as regulated or have different regulations. And the World Health Organization estimates that between 1% and 10% of drugs sold around the world are counterfeits. That's just a blanket statement, but that can be as high as 50% in some countries. Just a quick note here, for pharma, we're not just looking at scheduled pills in their final forms, but also active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, and precursor chemicals, which often come in powder form. So just in the bottom right, we can see a listing for iso or isotonazine, which is an opioid analgesic. It's a brown chemical with really high potency, slightly more potent than that of fentanyl.
We can kind of double click on that just a little bit. It's something that we've been following, at least at EverC and with some of our partners, is those precursor chemicals, or at least items and products that can be associated with producing counterfeit drugs. And seeing that chain kind of move from China and India, like you had mentioned, and influencing other regions. Precursor drugs have been shipped over to Mexico, where drug cartels will then produce fentanyl or whatever else, and then ship them up into the United States and Canada, largely contributing to the opioid epidemic. But also it's the destabilizing effect that it can have on a region and perpetuating violence surrounding that counterfeit market.
Absolutely. If we could go to the next slide, it actually speaks very well to your point.
I was a little bit ahead of you each time.
No, I love it. So yeah, when we look at supply chains, it's very much an idea of looking from source through transit onto destination. And you're completely correct in with a lot of especially the fentanyl precursors, like the synthetic opioid precursors, let's call them more generally. We can talk for days about the kind of developments in that space, that the drugs are moving from, let's say, China or an Asian country as a like research chemical or powder form, then being transported into, let's say, Central or Latin America. I'm not going to pick a particular country there, put into pill presses, and then transported to the destination, which is often in the West. And it's not so dissimilar what we're seeing with pharmaceuticals as we saw with antiquities and with PPE. So here we can see that objects are moving from source through transit to destination. And I think it's really important here to note that states can be involved or turn a blind eye to trafficking at any of these points, which really shows the corruption, which is a huge thing that we focus on at TRAC and at C4, that facilitates these crimes. So you got to like grease the wheels, you got to like bribe someone, you got to figure out how you're going to get your product cross border. Countries can also be placed in more than one category. So a country could serve as both a key transit and destination location. And then in this sort of middle part of the supply chain, there's a really important role played by free ports or free trade zones. These are really high security, high privacy regions, free from taxes and duties. And really, I like to think of them as like one-stop shops for smugglers or traffickers. Actually, the OECD says that with every new free trade zone, that drives up a 5.9% increase in the value of counterfeit exports. So it's sort of this cyclical process. And then in terms of the respirator trends that we saw, we saw mostly product, again, moving from China through actually Hong Kong, Peru, and South Korea onto destination markets in mostly the West. I don't want to completely generalize there. There's also like Japan in there, but let's say like Europe and the US.
Not to keep picking on China, but do you see any of these trends kind of following or at least being associated with the Belt and Road Initiative and how it's kind of moved across the region, or do you see it a little bit kind of divorced from that?
Well, I would say not necessarily with Belt and Road, but we did see what was really fascinating in terms of like compliance and regulation and enforcement in China is that there were much more strict punishments for those selling within the Chinese market with counterfeit respirators versus selling externally. So if you were selling like foreign actors and you were exporting these masks into like the US or other countries, you were, I don't want to say basically fine, but it's like a slap on the wrist versus if you were selling within China, you were in big, big trouble.
Mhm.
Next slide, please. So how do counterfeiters market and sell their products? One method is by spoofing or pretending to be legitimate sellers or distributors. On the right, you can see a no reply email where a user is posing to be a 3M authorized distributor. We also see fake documents that depict counterfeits as being genuine product. On the right, you can see fake ship notices, fake invoices. Many of these documents are taken from the open web, and then criminals simply manipulate the content of these documents to facilitate their transactions. And as Maya was mentioning earlier, it's really a abuse and misuse of brands that dupes customers into unknowingly, I should say, buying fake products posing huge threats to public health and safety. I will mention here there was a verify site, so there's all sorts of like, let's do RFIDs, let's do track and trace, let's figure out like how we can prevent these products from entering and supply chains. Even those sites can be spoofed. So it's very much like a cat and mouse game when we go after these actors to see how we can stay one step ahead of them. Next slide.
And I'm sure, I mean, at the time of COVID, everybody was so desperate to get their hands on, protective equipment that, going through those extra steps to make sure that it isn't counterfeit and that it's safe and it's tested. A lot of people were just, I mean, from memory, you actually see the evidence of just trying to get whatever they can.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's exactly what happened. Like there's this like capitalizing on the chaos of the pandemic, especially with the respirators, where people, when you're in this crisis moment and you're panicking and you just want to get your hands on the product, you're not doing as much due diligence, you're not doing as much research into what the product is. There were tremendous supply chain shortages. So it makes sense that people were buying things. And like after you look at a bunch of these counterfeits, you start to understand what a counterfeit might look like, but they do a pretty good job of replicating, really emulating the look and feel and even like smell of the product to throw off the scent of the consumer. So it's probably one of the most, and I wrote Melissa about this a lot too. It's like there's a lot of crimes that are unforgivable, but like the counterfeit respirator space during the pandemic was like probably top up there in terms of criminal intent.
The worst.
Yeah. So this is the money slide, right? What's really great about our public-private partnership with 3M was that we were able to contribute to the seizure of nearly 60 million counterfeit respirators worldwide, the takedown of over 36,000 deceptive social media posts, and the removal of nearly 50,000 fraudulent e-commerce offerings. Again, this was using experts or working with experts from a variety of different disciplines. I'm in public policy. We have colleagues at computer science and engineering. And yeah, we'll just go to the next slide for time purposes. I'm going to really quickly go through some final findings. So we're dealing with complex supply chains. They're truly transnational. And as we mentioned, most of these products are coming from China and sold to Western markets. We went over the use of false documents. Really want to emphasize the role of legitimate businesses. So from social media or social networking products to WhatsApp, WeChat, even like Google's Voice to fake phone numbers. No company is really immune from being abused for these kinds of crimes. We even found that LinkedIn was really widely used to sell bulk counterfeit respirators in the beginning of the pandemic. We even see some Chinese discussion boards explaining how to outwit anti-counterfeiting measures for companies such as Amazon. I mentioned this with the antiquities, but we see a commingling of products or convergence with other forms of illicit trade, and a variety of business models. So criminals will usually use an array of information to promote their businesses, whether they're business to customer or business to business B2B models to avoid detection. On the right here, you can see that the same user selling counterfeit Xanax on TikTok also was selling counterfeit 3M on Facebook. Again, just pointing to that convergence. Next slide, please. We see a sophistication and adaptability of the trade and mostly the actors behaving or acting in this trade. Here, I love this example of counterfeit Viagra and authentic Viagra, really demonstrating how skilled counterfeit producers have become in mimicking authentic product. This is facilitated by new technologies and allows for the production of more and more convincing fakes. If you're in that sort of space of looking at counterfeits, there's some of them are really, really spot on. There's even like shows.
Oh, yeah.
I mentioned the FTZs and data analytics, and I will actually go ahead and go to just the last slide. So maybe 2 forward, the thank you slide. So just a quick plug, so we leave some time for questions, is more details about our project and research can be found on TRAC's website, which is trac.gmu.edu. We also have a co-edited antiquities volume called Antiquity Smuggling in the Real and Virtual World, released by Routledge, beginning of 2021. Doesn't seem like it's that long away. And I thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'm super looking forward to a couple of minutes of Q&A.
Any questions from the audience? If not, I'm sure Maya or myself can sit here for the next 3 days and question Dr. Hashemi.
I wanted to kind of touch upon one of the last points that you made about complex business structures and kind of how it applies to the payment space. If you, in your experience, did you ever see, multiple front companies that are maybe registered in offshore havens pop up with, the counterfeit drugs or medical equipment, or even trying to confirm, the beneficial owners? It's something that we often are challenged with in our space. Or if it was a lot more trending towards just legitimate companies being abused or, spoofed, like you had mentioned with 3M.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of both. On the legitimate companies, what we found during the pandemic was that a lot of like textile or electronic companies that are already registered, already established, shift to making respirators to kind of fill in that gap of the demand. So there's a huge rise in the increase, like face masks were being used in, construction, industrial settings, in hospitals for frontline, like healthcare workers. But the public didn't need that many respirators for this huge surge in demand. So we did see, like, for instance, like clothing companies stepping in, like one I think was like an athletic sportswear company that was like all of a sudden going to make respirators. Or for instance, another company was a whiskey distillery that started to make hand sanitizer. So ones that, companies that had the capacity and the infrastructure to kind of do that shifted, not necessarily being experts in the space. Same thing with the Chinese companies that we're looking into. A lot of them were registered companies, like electronic companies, that kind of shifted their business scope. And in terms of beneficial ownership, I mean, there's a lot, and I'm sure many on this call see the same thing, where it's put the business name under your cousin or your spouse or your child. Like a lot of family, like keep it in the family businesses, which have been, interesting to watch. It's fascinating to see how like maybe the prime person or the like lead contact of a business might not have super active social media accounts, but like their wife might, and they're posting about, oh, they just got out of jail. Like it's just insane, as you both know, or what people will post online and what kind of nuggets and great leads we can find from just publicly available information.
Don't talk about that too much. We don't want to teach people not to disclose that to us, because those nuggets might get a lovely
It's
hopscotch.
true. I mean, definitely post your photos.
Please.
Oh, absolutely.
We're coming up on time. I wanted to reach back and touch our brothers and sisters in the marketplace community. the challenge that huge platforms have in trying to disrupt bad actors is monumental. And I think certainly in the antiquities examples, as you mentioned, trying to discern secondary resellers of legitimate products, secondary resellers of illegitimate products, it's a never-ending quest for them to try and knock it down. I think they're doing, as you know, they're drinking from the fire hose. It's the volume of it. I think in service to them, knowing them and knowing the work that they're doing, I would love to see us partner more on a buyer outreach program to knock down the demand, and give a little break to the payments ecosystem a little bit, because they're carrying a lot of water in the compliance arena, and I'd love to knock down the demand on that. We're at time.
Yeah, no, and I just want to take a second to thank you, Melissa and Maya and everyone for making that effort, because I think that that's exactly what we need, is to be collaborating on this to be able to address these issues.
Absolutely. Yeah, look, it's going to take all of us putting away the competitive gauntlet and saying, how do we fix it? Let's knock it down. We can do this. I think we're all skilled enough to do it. We're at time. You're both brilliant. Thank you so much. Please stay safe, stay strong. We're going to win this. Take care, everybody.